Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will be monitoring those questions, and I'll be able to feed those to Becky and Kevin later this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the talk over to Kevin Crooks, and hope you enjoy.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. I wish we could see you in person. I would love to visit the gardens up there in Vail as soon as we're able. I will share my screen now. And hopefully you can all see my PowerPoint slides now. So again, thanks for the introduction. So what Dr. Niemiec and I plan to do today is talk to you more about the restoration of gray wolves to Colorado and how science can inform this issue. For me, I thought I would start by just giving you a little bit more information about myself. So as Nanette said, I'm a wildlife biologist, and much of my work has focused on carnivore ecology, including mountain lions and bobcats and coyotes and foxes and bears and wolves. I'm also helping direct the Center for Human-Carnivore Coexistence at CSU, and we're a team of social scientists like Dr. Niemiec and myself, ecological scientists, and our mission is to develop approaches to minimize conflict between people and carnivores, including wolves, if they're restored to Colorado. And then just on a personal note, I grew up here in Colorado. I have deep roots here in the Rocky Mountain West. My mom's side was an early pioneer family in Wyoming. This you see here is my great grandmother. She was born in the Wind Rivers in the late 1800s here with an elk in 1917. Her son, so my grandfather, like myself, was also a wildlife biologist. He started as a hunting guide around Teton, and then he eventually became the state game warden in Wyoming and served on the State Wildlife Commission. He was an ardent opponent of wolves, and he and I had many discussions about wolves. And so I feel like I understand his perspective and why people, particularly in rural communities, might have negative perceptions towards wolves. So today, Dr. Niemiec and I are here as scientists who feel that science should help guide wildlife management and policy. So we're not here to advocate for or against the ballot initiative specifically, but rather to provide scientific information on the wolf issue. Now, fortunately, wolves are very well studied, and there's a large body of scientific knowledge to help guide these kinds of discussions. So what are the prospects for wolf restoration in Colorado? That's what I'm going to focus on, is the wolf ecology topic. So what does the science tell us on this? Well, we know that wolves are native to Colorado. They were once distributed throughout the state, but were eradicated from Colorado by government-sponsored predator control in the late 1800s, the early 1900s. The last wolves were killed in Colorado in the 1940s. So for the most part, wolves have been largely absent from the state for 75 to 80 years. But science tells us that Colorado still supports suitable habitat for wolves. Wolves can live in a variety of habitat types as long as there's enough prey, and also that if they're tolerated by people. They can occur in places with much higher human density than Colorado, particularly the Western slope, such as the Great Lakes states and in Europe. Now, in the Western US, the best habitat for wolves is on public land, where there's abundant prey and open space, and also where there's less potential for conflict with people. Now, in Colorado, it supports over 24 million acres of public land, mostly on the western slope. And it also supports a large population of mule deer and elk, which are the primary prey of wolves, and what scientific studies show us are one of the best predictors of wolf habitat quality. Colorado Parks and Wildlife estimates that Colorado supports over 280,000 elk, which is the largest elk population in any state. It also supports over 430,000 mule deer. Now, multiple scientific studies have concluded that Colorado can still support a viable population of wolves. In fact, in a review published several years ago by Dr. David Meach, who's one of the world's foremost wolf experts, Dr. Meach specifically identified Colorado and Western Colorado as prime for wolf restoration. Now, when you look at the distribution of wolves in North America, and you can see that here in the orange, the dark orange, it becomes clear that Colorado is currently a broken link in an otherwise continuous chain of wolf populations along the Rocky Mountain spine, from Alaska down through Canada, and then into the Southwest US and even into northern Mexico. And for this reason, Dr. Meach has said that reestablishing wolves in Western Colorado could connect this entire North American wolf population, which would be difficult to overestimate the biological and conservation value of this achievement. So as Nanette introduced, the ballot proposition 114, it's a citizen-initiated measure, and it's on the ballot now. Many of us have probably received the blue book already describing it. So under the proposition, if it passes, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission would be required to develop a science-based plan to restore and manage gray wolves in Colorado. So this would be focused on the Western Slope, and it would need to be initiated by the end of 2023. Now, wolves are listed as an endangered species in Colorado, both at the federal level under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the Endangered Species Act, but wolves are also listed, gray wolves are also listed as an endangered species by the state of Colorado as well. An important conservation goal for endangered species is that they recover to form what we call a self-sustaining or a viable population, which is one that has sufficient numbers and sufficient distribution so that it has a high likelihood of persisting over the long term. Now, over the past year, and you've probably heard this, Colorado Parks and Wildlife has documented a pack of up to 6 wolves in Northwest Colorado, and then another lone wolf in Northern Colorado in North Park. It's important to emphasize that this small number of wolves in one corner of the state would not be considered a viable population for Colorado. These wolves are at risk. They may be killed or simply disappear, as has happened to the few other wolves that have migrated to Colorado. Indeed, there's recent reports that some of these Colorado wolves, maybe up to 3 wolves in the pack, were shot and killed along the Wyoming-Colorado border. Now, wolves, because they're listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in Colorado, they have full legal protection. But wolves in Wyoming have no legal protection in most of the state, in that predator zone you see here on the map of Wyoming. This means they can be killed on site with no hunting license and no hunting season. So this makes it much more challenging for wolves to migrate from the Yellowstone region down through Wyoming into Colorado. And it therefore lowers the likelihood that a viable population could arise in Colorado from natural migration or natural colonization. So ultimately, if Colorado wants to restore a viable population of wolves to the state, if that's the goal, then active reintroduction by wildlife managers would improve the odds of achieving that goal. And these kinds of reintroductions have occurred elsewhere, as you probably know, for gray wolves up in the Yellowstone region, for Mexican wolves, which is a subspecies of gray wolf, down in Arizona and New Mexico, and also for the red wolf, which is a different species in the southeast in North Carolina. Okay, so if wolves did return fully to Colorado, what might be the impacts? Well, one concern that is sometimes expressed is the direct threat of wolves to human safety, the risk that wolves might attack or kill people or children. So what do the facts tell us on this? Well, in North America, there's only been 2 recorded instances of people killed by wolves since 1900, one in Canada and the other in Alaska. There's been no humans killed by wolves in the lower 48 US states since 1900s. Another example is in Yellowstone National Park. Wolves were first reintroduced there in 1995, and there's been no wolf attacks on people since then. Yellowstone receives 4 million visitors per year, including a lot of tent campers. What we know about wolves is that they typically avoid humans, so direct encounters are rare. So therefore, they represent little direct threat to human safety. Now, another consideration is the potential impacts of wolves on big game population, and therefore hunting opportunities. So what does the science tell us on this? Well, multiple scientific studies have indicated that under certain conditions, wolves can contribute to local declines in prey numbers, in big game numbers. And that's especially true when wolf predation is acting in concert with other factors that are also limiting big game, such as harsh weather, severe winters, human hunting. And if this is the case, then this could impact hunting opportunities at a local scale for some herds. But we also know that wolves, big game, and hunting can and do coexist, as is demonstrated by abundant big game and hunter harvests in states with wolves, such as Alaska and the Great Lakes states and the Northern Rocky Mountains. And we can look to the Northern Rocky Mountains for some insight on this. So these are data taken from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and it's the number of elk harvested each year by hunters from 2004 to 2018. And you can see that the elk harvest in Montana at a statewide level has not declined over the past 20 years, despite a significant increase in wolf populations in Montana. And these same trends are evident at a statewide level for Idaho and Wyoming. Now that's at a statewide level. At a local level, the effects of wolves can vary. So what the data tell us is that elk numbers are stable or increasing in many areas where wolves and elk interact around the Yellowstone region. But in other areas, elk numbers have declined due in part to wolf predation. So ultimately, if wolves are fully restored to Colorado, we might expect something similar: local impacts on some herds and hunting opportunities, particularly when wolf predation is acting in conjunction with other factors to limit big game. But we would expect a relatively low impact on big game and hunting at a statewide level. There's also been considerable discussion about the ecological effects of wolves, the potential for this top predator, this apex predator, to generate ecological effects that ripple through the food web. So what does the science tell us on this? And this is complicated, but studies primarily in Yellowstone National Park, but also other protected areas like Banff National Park, have concluded that wolves might help reduce overbrowsing by elk and deer, which may allow vegetation plants to recover, which can improve habitat for other animals, such as birds or beavers. But science also tells us that the effects of wolves are complex, and that wolves are likely not solely responsible for the kinds of ecosystem changes that have been documented in Yellowstone over the past 20 years since they've been reintroduced. It's also unclear to what extent those kinds of ecological impacts might translate to other systems outside of national parks, including in Colorado. So in short, it's a complicated story. But what we might expect in Colorado, if their wolves are fully restored to Colorado, wolves might generate notable ecological effects where they occur in high enough densities for a long enough time. But in other areas where there's lower densities of wolves, or where there, of course, are no wolves, then ecological effects would be less evident or absent. Now, the wildlife management community has a variety of tools to manage predators and big game and hunting to ensure that they can coexist. For example, regulated harvest or hunting of big game and predators can help achieve management goals. Multiple scientific studies have also indicated that habitat quality is often a stronger driver of big game populations than is predation. So another management tool is habitat management to ensure thriving big game herds. And also scientific monitoring of big game and predators can be conducted to help ensure that the numbers of predators and the number of prey on the landscape achieves the desired balance, achieves the management objectives for the state. Okay, now perhaps the most contentious discussion or topic about the potential restoration of wolves to Colorado is the impacts of wolves on livestock and the livestock industry and individual ranchers. Again, we can gain some insight from the Northern Rocky Mountains on this. And so I'm again showing data from Montana. This is data from the USDA, and it basically shows the it shows the unwanted causes of death of cattle as reported by producers, reported by ranchers themselves. And what you can see from these data is that wolves account for only 1% of the reported unwanted losses of cattle in Montana. Most of the unwanted deaths of cattle are things like lambing or calving or weather or other maladies. The amount of cattle that are killed by wolves represents a very small percentage, less than 1% of the total inventory of 4 million cattle in Montana. And it also represents less than 1% of the annual gross income of the livestock industry in Montana and in the northern Rocky Mountains. But again, that's at a statewide level. So although wolves have a relatively small impact at the industry statewide scale, wolves do kill livestock. And these costs are unevenly distributed, with some producers suffering greater losses than others. And wolves can have a substantial economic and emotional impact for those individual ranchers when wolves move in and kill or chase or stress out their livestock. And it's not just killing livestock, but it's also what we call indirect losses, such as reduced weight gain or reproduction due to stress. And these are real impacts that are important to consider, because it's going to be these individual ranchers that are going to bear the brunt of the cost that wolves might cause if they're restored. Now, again, there are a variety of different management tools to help minimize this kind of conflict between livestock and wolves. Some of the tools are what we call reactive, meaning that the management occurs after the conflict happens. So these, for example, are lethal tools. So a wolf kills livestock, the wolf is found, and it itself is lethally controlled. It is killed, it's removed. But there's also a whole other set of tools that what we call are proactive, which are trying to prevent the conflict in the first place through non-lethal techniques. So methods such as barriers, fences, flagging, scare devices, human presence, range riders, along with livestock herds, or guardian dogs. All of these might serve to deter predators. We can work to alter grazing strategies to minimize overlap between livestock and predators, including wolves, particularly during sensitive periods such as calving or lambing. We can also try to reduce attractants, things that might attract predators to places with livestock, such as dead livestock, so removing carcasses from the landscape. And then we can also try to compensate ranchers for their losses, both direct losses, mortality, but also indirect losses. Now, this combination of techniques can work. And a good example of this is the Blackfoot Challenge. It's a grassroots, community-based cooperative of landowners in the Blackfoot Valley in Montana. And one of their stated goals is to reduce human-wildlife conflict through these kinds of proactive and preventative strategies. And so they, for example, focus a lot on range riding programs, people out with the herd, but also carcass removal, where they take livestock that die for whatever reason and bring them into places where they bury them. And it can work. So this is data from the Blackfoot Challenge. So this is from 2007 to 2016. And the green line here is the number of wolves in the system, in the watershed. And you can see that the number of wolves increased dramatically and is now hovering around 40 to 50 wolves, so a healthy population of wolves. But at the same time, the number of wolves killed because of livestock depredation, which is the red line, you can see that's been very low. Also, the number of livestock killed by wolves is also very low. So this is what coexistence can look like. So if wolves were to be restored to Colorado, one goal could be to minimize, of course, the number of livestock dying and also the number of wolves dying. So to conclude, a key point I try to get across in the wildlife management courses I teach at Colorado State is that wildlife management is often much more about people than it is about wildlife. And such is definitely the case with wolves. In fact, much of the conflict about wolves isn't necessarily direct conflict between people and wolves, but rather conflict among people about wolves, what we call social conflict. And this is what Dr. Niemiec will discuss in her presentation. Scientific studies throughout the range of wolves have demonstrated that human tolerance of wolves, the degree to which they allow them to persist in the system, is one of the key determinants if they can persist in a landscape. So ultimately, if wolves were to be restored fully to Colorado, what is needed are collaborative, participatory approaches that ensure diverse perspectives are heard. And this would help us better understand and address conflict around wolves. And this is what Dr. Niemiec will be discussing next. This is also a goal of our center, to minimize that kind of conflict. Again, conflict not just between people and carnivores, but also among people about carnivores. And I'd just like to end by putting in one last plug on our educational materials that Nanette showed you. We've developed a long series of FAQs and also 12 information sheets, which were published through CSU Extension. And you can find those if you Google CSU and wolves or the Center for Human-Carnivore Coexistence and wolves, you'll be able to find that information. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Niemiec.
Right. Thank you, Kevin. I will go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. All right, perfect. I'll go ahead and get started. So building on what Kevin was talking about, I'm going to talk a little bit more about public perceptions, media coverage, and stakeholder conflict related to proposed wolf reintroduction here in Colorado. So I wanted to start off by first telling you a little bit more about me. So I consider myself a conservation psychologist. And what that means is I apply social psychology and psychology theories to understand the human aspects of conservation issues. And so through my work, I examine people's perspectives and actions and behaviors towards conservation initiatives. So I've been involved in the wolf issue for about 2 years now. I've helped conduct a statewide survey of public opinion on wolf restoration here in Colorado, conducted a media analysis of how the media was portraying public perspectives towards wolves here in Colorado and some of the key issues that were happening. And I've also worked with Kevin and others at our center to bring together diverse stakeholders and dialogue about that social conflict that he was just talking about, to explore potential pathways forward. So I'll talk about a little bit of that work today. But first, I wanted to start off with this question of why should we even understand and consider public perspectives towards wolves? And the nice thing is I feel like Dr. Crooks already covered this really well, so I don't have to kind of repeat what he already said, but I will just say, as he was talking about, ultimately, whether wolves are reintroduced, whether they thrive, or whether they're killed, is not just a question of biology, of wildlife management, but it's really comes down to a question of people's values and actions, and really whose values are incorporated into decision making. So I think it's really important to understand these diverse values and perspectives towards wolves, so we can incorporate those diverse values and perspectives moving forward in wildlife management. So what are public perspectives and values towards wolves and wolf reintroduction? So there's a group of us social scientists who have been looking at this for a while now. Well, as many of you probably know, in the early 20th century, the public rhetoric around wolves and wolf management was very different than it is now. And as Dr. Crooks was talking about, early settlers really killed wolves not just to protect livestock, but really out of fear and loathing for species that had been demonized for centuries, really in folklore and myth. We've all heard about Little Red Riding Hood. And so both federal, state governments provided financial incentives in the form of bounties to those who killed wolves in order to facilitate their eradication. And by the 1930s, wolves were pretty much gone from more than 95% of their historic range. But we started to see a public attitude shift really in the mid 20th century. And that kind of coincided with an increased interest in the preservation of wilderness more broadly. So wolves became a federally protected species in the United States in the 1970s through the passage of the Endangered Species Act. And after that, efforts to recover wolves really began. And so a political scientist, Dr. Martin Nye, wrote that for many, the wolf began to really symbolize a chance to atone and to make amends with wildlife and wilderness. And we found that increased support for wolf reintroduction has been associated with changes in the US population's values towards wildlife and towards wilderness over time. And so now studies actually find that the majority of Americans generally have positive attitudes towards wolves and are supportive of wolf reintroduction efforts. So for example, a 2014 study which looked at a variety of different Americans' perspectives towards wolves found that 61% were pretty supportive of wolf conservation. Of course, this does vary by stakeholder group, by geography. Studies throughout the US find that support is generally lower among those in rural areas, among those who live next to wolves, live in wolf territory, as well as ranchers and hunters too. Now, what's going on? How about here in Colorado? What do Coloradans think about wolf reintroduction? So there's been 3 main studies that have examined this. There was a 1994 mail survey of over 1,000 Coloradan residents. There was a 2001 phone survey of 500 Coloradan residents, and a 2019 online survey that we recently conducted. And do note that the online survey wasn't like we posted it on Facebook. This was through a sample that was recruited, a random sample independent of their knowledge of the survey topic. Social scientists are increasingly using online samples due to the bias from low response rates from phone and mail surveys. But I think we can get kind of the most accurate picture here by looking across all 3 of these surveys, looking at the public at different times using different recruitment methodologies. And what we find here is that actually the majority of Coloradans do support wolf restoration. So our survey found that 84% would vote in favor of wolf restoration. The 2001 survey found 66%, and the 1994 survey found that 71% would vote in favor of wolf restoration. Now, a common narrative that we often hear is that there's this urban-rural difference and divide in perspective towards wolves. And actually, as I mentioned, studies in the US more broadly have found that that tends to generally be true. Those in more rural areas who are living with the negative impacts of wolves tend to have more negative attitudes towards wolves. And we certainly see some of those patterns play out here. We have some groups and county commissioners and others who are on the West Slope who have come out against wolf restoration. But what's interesting is when we do surveys, we find that actually the majority of residents report in surveys on the West Slope that they would still support wolf restoration. So both the mail and the online survey from 1994 and 2019 found that 65 to 80% of West Slope residents would vote for wolf reintroduction. So actually this idea of the urban-rural divide, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not so straightforward because we do have a lot of folks on the West Slope who do want wolves. And something that's really interesting is one of the things we also found both in the phone survey from 2001 as well as our more recent online survey is that the majority of hunters actually indicated in both surveys, people who self-identify as hunters in Colorado indicated that they would support wolf restoration, which I found was particularly interesting because we have some hunting stakeholder groups, formal organizations who have come out quite opposed to wolf restoration. So there's some interesting complicated dynamics when we think about kind of the social system that we're dealing with here. When we get into ranchers, support starts to drop among people who strongly identify as ranchers. And a 2001 phone survey found that the majority of ranchers did not support wolf restoration. We found kind of mixed results on that in various surveys. So I think more research on that has to be done. But obviously there's some very strong ranching stakeholder groups who have come out pretty strongly against wolf reintroduction. Okay, so why do people support and oppose wolf restoration? So we conducted, in our survey, we asked this question: how do you think wolves will affect you positively or negatively? And these were some of the answers that people gave in our 2019 survey for why they would support wolf restoration, how they thought wolves would support them positively. So one of the things that they've talked about and that Dr. Crooks already talked about was this idea of balanced ecosystems. This was by far the most common response. This idea that wolves would improve the environment to some extent or help provide balance to ecosystems. People also talked about opportunities for viewing wolves in the wild. People really wanted that opportunity. People talked about emotional and cultural connections to wolves. A lot of people felt like they had really deep connections to the species, and it would mean a lot to them to have the species on the landscape. People talked about moral arguments, and this basically means any argument along the lines of, I think wolf restoration is the right thing to do because wolves once lived in our state, so they deserve to live here, and it's our obligation as people to coexist with species that are native to an area. People also talked about wolves' potential to control pests, and also what we call existence value in social science. And this is basically the fact that people feel good knowing that wolves are out there and will be out there for future generations, for their kids. It makes them feel good even if they never end up seeing wolves themselves. And finally, people talked about tourism, enhanced tourism revenue related to wolf viewing opportunities. Now, why are folks opposed to wolf restoration? These were the different responses we got on the survey, and Dr. Crooks has already spoken to a lot of these. Actually, the most common concern brought up in our statewide surveys was human safety. And so people were quite worried about wolves wandering into residential areas, posing a threat while recreating. People also talked about reduced hunting opportunities, reduction in wildlife, deer and elk populations. There was some concern about pet attacks. So worried about that if they were out there recreating, hunting, anything with their dogs, they would have to worry about their dogs getting attacked by wolves or other pets getting attacked by wolves. There was also the concern of livestock losses that we've talked about. And related to that, this idea that wolf management will be difficult. It'll be difficult to figure out how to develop a compensation program that fairly compensates ranchers, not just for those direct losses, but indirect losses. And it will be costly to try to make this program work. And then there were negative attitudes towards wolves more generally as another reason people were opposed. So this idea, this belief that wolves were are an evil or scary species that's out there. Now, the next question that I had in my own research was, is media coverage reflecting these public perspectives and values towards wolves? And what arguments does media coverage focus on? And the reason why I got interested in this is because media coverage can strongly influence public perceptions. We found that in a variety of different circumstances for wildlife management, that repeated exposure to media arguments can change people's beliefs over time. And we've also found that media coverage can reflect public perspectives. So it's another way to try to understand what's going on with different members of the public and stakeholder groups on an issue. And what's interesting is there's been a variety of studies that have looked at media coverage of wolf management and wildlife management more broadly in the US. And these past studies have found that media coverage is mostly actually negative when talking about wolf conservation and restoration. But it does vary by geography and by the presence of wolves. And so this 2010 study, they basically found that the anticipated presence of wolf populations can actually increase negative discourse about wolves in the media. But what's interesting is in areas where wolves had been there for a long time, actually coverage of wolves became more positive as people got used to living with the negative impacts of wolves. Studies have also found that more local media sources, so state or even more local, like regional newspapers, tend to focus on more negative impacts of wolves and conflict and other predators, whereas more national media sources tend to focus on the more positive impacts of wolves and views on wolf restoration and other carnivore conservation. So we were interested in whether these same patterns were happening here in Colorado. So what we did is, this was back in 2019, the same year that we conducted our online survey. I'm sure media coverage may have changed in the past year since that. And I know there's additional arguments that have been brought up in the media since that. So keep that in mind as I'm reporting these results. But what we did is for the year of 2019, we gathered 35 different news articles that all focused, and these were all the news articles in 2019, mostly from the top 10 circulated daily newspapers in Colorado that focused on wolf restoration. And then we coded them to look at whether, essentially we read through each of them and looked at whether they were using the same positive and negative arguments that I brought up earlier in this presentation that the public brought up, and whether there was any additional arguments that the media brought up that the public had not. And one of the things that we found is that most news coverage in Colorado, at least during that year, focused on only a few of the many positive and negative arguments identified from our public survey. So on the positive side, media coverage tended to focus just on this idea of restoring the balance. Wolves will improve the environment, rather than all of those other kind of positive impacts I laid out, such as emotional or cultural connections or moral arguments. And on the negative side, media coverage mostly tended to focus on livestock impacts and reductions in deer and elk populations. Very rarely brought up this idea of the safety of humans or concerns about the safety of pets or this fear of wolves more generally as a species. And then we found also that the media tended to focus on more negative themes than positive themes as well. And so this actually supports prior literature that suggests that kind of more local media sources tend to focus on more negative themes and tend to be more negative even when the public in general has more positive views towards species conservation. Okay, so I just want to end in my last couple minutes here with this question of, okay, so we have all these different perspectives, we have these groups that are in conflict, we have these different concerns and hopes. And so how do we move forward with this? How can Colorado ensure diverse public perspectives and values are heard and incorporated into decision making? So Dr. Crooks talked about this a little bit already, but there's a couple of key things that I want to cover here. And the first is that if our goal is really to make sure diverse values and perspectives are heard and to reduce the social conflict or this conflict between different stakeholder groups, then traditional public engagement processes are not sufficient. And by traditional public engagement processes, I mean basically public hearings and public comment periods where you hold a meeting and people come to the meeting, just like in this photo, and they protest and they yell and they try to get their point across. And the reason why these processes are not sufficient is because they don't allow the different groups who are in conflict to engage in empathy building, trust building, perspective taking, and start to break down those damaging assumptions that the different groups make about each other when thinking about wildlife management moving forward. And so instead, to do all of these things, we really need stakeholder engagement processes that ensure that diverse perspectives are equally represented moving forward. And it's really important to bring stakeholders together in this constructive dialogue about the deeper drivers of conflict. And so actually holding stakeholder workshops and meetings where you bring together folks from the ranching community, you bring together folks from the hunting community, the animal rights community, the conservation and environmental community, as well as sovereign Native American nations and folks from federal and state government, and actually engage in that difficult dialogue where you talk about those deeper values related to wolf management and start to understand those different perspectives. And then it's really important that this group of stakeholders actually have a meaningful say in decision making. And so it doesn't make a difference, and it can actually backfire to just have a stakeholder group on the side who is talking about the conflict over wolves, who doesn't inform decision making. Rather, we need that group to work with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and other folks who will be tasked with managing wolves in the state to actually have a say in that decision-making process. And so any sort of collaboration and compromises that are formed are actually put into action. And we did actually run a pilot workshop to try out this collaborative approach of bringing together key stakeholders back in February. And what we did is our center worked with Francine Madden with the Center for Conservation Peace Building. She's a third-party facilitator or neutral who runs these what she calls conflict transformation programs or workshops. And so we brought together 31 key stakeholders from around the state, representing those different groups and interests in sovereign nations that I talked about. And we spent 2 days exploring what an inclusive stakeholder process could look like for reducing social conflict and ensuring diverse values are heard. And what was amazing about this process is folks started off coming to the 2-day workshop, and it was really tense, and I can tell that groups were frustrated with each other because there were some that were pushing the ballot initiative, others who were pushing campaigns against the ballot initiative. But we all started talking about how wolves relate to our deeper identity, our deeper values, our deeper basic human needs. And then we all started realizing we all have these same basic needs, and the different groups are not trying to attack each other's values and needs. They're just trying to make sure their own needs are met. And so we started breaking down those damaging assumptions that the groups make about each other, and started to envision what a hopeful pathway forward could look like for Colorado in terms of collaborative decision making. And so I'll just end off today with just this one quote from one of our workshop participants. I always feel like it's great to end off on a positive note with wolves, because often we can get so caught up in that social conflict. And one thing he said at the end of the workshop was, "This is hopefully the beginning of a considerate and concerted conversation that empowers and doesn't leave people behind." And that's what I also hope for wolf management moving forward. So thank you very much for having me here today. Look forward to our Q&A. And I will go ahead and stop sharing right now.
Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed a presentation by Kevin and Becky. Apparently had a little trouble with our introduction, getting that out to the public, but just to let everybody know that tomorrow night, in case you're interested in more of the pro and con issues, the Vail Symposium will also have a program with Mike Phillips, a Montana State Senator, and Sean Martini, an advocate for the Colorado Farm Bureau. So you can sign up for that at the Vail Symposium website. But if any of you have some questions for Kevin and Becky, please enter them into the Q&A box and I will pass them on to them. And the first question is, how many wolves would be introduced to Colorado? What are the plans?
I could address that. Maybe it's simple because the plans haven't yet been developed. So the plans would be, if the ballot initiative passes, then the wildlife biologists at Colorado Parks and Wildlife would develop that science-based plan. So it's yet to be determined how many wolves would be reintroduced and where they would be reintroduced. The ballot initiative again calls for them to be reintroduced on the western slope. We can gain some insight from other places where wolves were introduced. For example, in Yellowstone, they introduced about 15, 16 wolves one year and then introduced another 15 or 16 the next year. So they introduced a little over 30 wolves and kind of let the population go from there. But again, the details in Colorado would be determined by the biologists at Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
And then Donette asks, are the gray wolves the same species that were originally here in Colorado?
Yeah, that's a good question. They are. So the gray wolf is Canis lupus, and they actually were the little fun fact that you can share with your friends. They were actually the most widely distributed land mammal on the planet. They occurred throughout the northern hemisphere, and they also occurred throughout much of North America and throughout Colorado. So yes, they're native here, the gray wolf, Canis lupus.
And what would be the population of wolves that we would need? Is there an estimated time frame for that from Sheena? Yeah,
well, again, that's another really good question that will yet to be determined in terms of the numbers of wolves that Colorado could support. There have been some past studies on this. So there was a study published in 1994 that estimated that Colorado could support 1,000 wolves. there was a study published in 2005 or 2006 that estimated Colorado could support 400, at least 400 wolves. And that was even after accounting for future human population growth, future urban development for the next 20, 25 years. So, you know, those are some past estimates. I will say that one thing that is needed, I would say, in terms of research is more work as to where can wolves persist, where is their good habitat, where is there low potential for conflict for people, and how many wolves ultimately could persist in Colorado. But I will say, though, that multiple studies have concluded that Colorado can support a viable population of wolves.
Well, that's a pretty interesting lead to the next question, which is how might this impact the wolves all the way from Yellowstone to the Yukon, and would Mexican wolves benefit from wolves being reintroduced to Colorado?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll take this one too. I'm sticking, I'll do the wolf ecology part. When we start talking about humans, I'm gonna throw it over to Dr. Niemiec, but let's see. So yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So historically, wolves occurred again throughout North America. There was a lot of interbreeding between different subspecies of wolves. In fact, the subspecies designation of wolves is sort of complicated and unclear. The Mexican wolf is a separate subspecies. It's the probably most genetically distinct subspecies of gray wolf that we have here in North America. And it's also legally protected separate from the rest of the gray wolves in North America. So they're listed as an endangered species of an endangered subspecies. We have some detailed information on this in that educational material, but right now the Mexican wolf population is relatively small. And so while it's small, it probably wouldn't benefit wolves, the Mexican wolves, for northern wolves to come into the population, because it might dilute the unique genetic characteristics of the Mexican wolf, if that makes sense. But ultimately, as the Mexican wolf population grows and becomes larger, then some, what we call gene flow, some individuals coming in from other populations, from other states, would potentially benefit Mexican wolves, because it would increase their genetic variability, which allows populations to persist longer. Again, historically, all of these wolves were probably interbreeding with one another and moving relatively long distances.
Yeah,
so that's
yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, is that why the Mexican wolves ended up being basically a separate species, because they have been separated from the gene pool?
Well, that's a good question. They're a separate subspecies, so they're all still gray wolves, Canis lupus. The Mexican wolf is a different subspecies. I mean, it's possible because the numbers of Mexican wolves went down to such a small population size in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that it's possible, but during that time that they did genetically differ from the rest of wolves in North America. That's conceivable. But historically, there was probably some genetic difference between Mexican wolves and the other subspecies, but also a lot of interbreeding as well.
Okay, and then, well, one, I guess, final question is, so is your take that science is in favor of reintroduction? And are there any real cons from your perspective?
Well, Becky, do you want to take this one? Well, I'll just say something, which is that science really doesn't speak to whether or not people would be in favor of wolf reintroduction or not. What we're trying to do here is provide scientific information that can help inform those kinds of decisions. But this is an arena that is better left for Dr. Niemiec, I think.
No, I think you said that perfectly, where science can tell us a lot of things, especially ecological research can tell us if Colorado can support a viable population, can tell us about the negative impacts, potentially the positive impacts. But ultimately, I think the decision of whether we have wolves comes down to whether people want wolves and how we incorporate these diverse values around wolves into decision making, and who gets a say in decision making. So so I think the science can inform us, but ultimately it comes down to the people.
And then we have a question about taxpayer dollars. Do they, are they part of this bill? And if so, how and what does the money provide?
Well, maybe I should just record myself saying the details are yet to be determined.
Okay.
But yeah, but it's, you know, it's what I can say is that the ballot initiative does call for, you know, Colorado Parks and Wildlife to develop the plan and then oversee the plan to manage wolves. And there's been a fiscal analysis because it's a ballot initiative. They do a fiscal analysis, and that fiscal analysis suggests that the first couple of years of developing the plan would cost about $350,000 to $450,000 a year. And then once wolves were restored and the reintroduction was happening and then wolves would be managed, maybe that would be about $1 million per year. That might sound like a big number, and it is. It's less than 1% of the budget of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, though. Sort of where that comes from is yet to be determined. In the ballot initiative, they do indicate, for example, that a compensation fund needs to be established that would pay livestock owners for losses. And in the initiative, the way it's worded is that those funds would come from the wildlife cash funds in Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which are primarily coming from hunter and angling licenses. So the way the mechanisms right now is set up is that it would come in part from there. I do think that that is a place where more work needs to be done, more decisions need to be made to think about other mechanisms by which the broader population of Colorado supports the economically supports wolf management and restoration if the ballot initiative passes.
All right, and then on a question of what exactly is the ecological benefit of reintroduction from your perspectives?
Okay, well, I can address that, and I discussed some of this. There's a variety of benefits and there's a variety of costs, and how you weigh those costs and benefits is up to each individual person. There is an ecological benefit of restoring wolves to Colorado to allow for this continuous population, this connectivity of wolves along the spine of the continent, basically, the Rocky Mountains from Alaska down into Mexico. As I discussed, there might be some situations in Colorado where wolves, if they occur in high enough densities, might help to reduce, for example, overabundant elk populations. Colorado Parks and Wildlife estimate that designate about 45% of the elk herds in the state are overabundant, or they're overpopulation objectives. So it's possible that if wolves were in enough numbers that they could help limit some big game populations in some areas if they're acting in conjunction with other factors, and that might reduce overbrowsing, might benefit, you know, streamside vegetation like willow and aspen.
Yeah, and that's probably, I was just
Yeah.
going to say, that's probably a really good segue into with the cost of introducing wolves impact monies allocated for other conservation efforts in the state. I guess that's a TBD also.
Well, Becky, did you have something that you wanted to say about the funding part earlier?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little tidbit, which was in our survey, we actually did ask this question of the Colorado public, whether they would be willing to pay taxes to fund the reintroduction effort. And something that was interesting is that when we asked people if they support reintroduction, as I showed those numbers say that most people would support reintroduction, but when we ask people if they're willing to pay for it, then it quickly drops and it actually drops below 50%. And so I think it's definitely something that has to be worked out in terms of we do have folks who will have to deal with more of the negative impacts of wolves, and how do we make sure that everyone helps pay for that?
All right, and then there was the how many generations, if the wolves thrive and produce offspring, would it take, or how long would they be monitored or tracked? I guess that would really depend on what the histories you've seen in other states, and I also assume the plan is to be determined. But what would be your best guess as to how you want to monitor?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. We can actually. if you're watching this and it's recorded, if you flip back to the slide where I showed the increase in wolf populations in Montana, I think it was starting like in 2004. The wolf population, there were several different reintroductions in Yellowstone and up in Idaho, a relatively small number of wolves really, and they rapidly grew. I mean, within a decade or so, they were rapidly growing and then started to level off. Again, wolves are really adaptable critters. I mean, they can live in a variety of habitat types and do pretty well as long as people, don't kill them. So they're going to be able to live in a variety of places where humans tolerate them and reproduce relatively rapidly. So I would imagine, in a decade or two, you might have kind of more wolves distributed in more parts of the state where they could persist. But again, that's very speculative, and the details will be worked out. In terms of monitoring, I should say that we can look to the lynx. So, lynx were reintroduced to Colorado. And initially, usually with these kinds of reintroductions of any wildlife, including carnivores, predators, they'll probably put radio collars or GPS collars on these animals and track them to know where they are. But at some point in time, when the population starts to get more numerous and when they start to be distributed in more places, they just can't collar as many or track as many. And so then the animals are just out there doing their thing. We can monitor them non-invasively with things like remote cameras, which I expect might be another way ultimately that the state could monitor predator and prey in these areas.
Okay, well, I think we have answered all the questions, so I really appreciate your time, Dr. Crooks and Dr. Niemiec, and I would assume that if anyone would like to get in touch with you, they can always find your email addresses at the CSU website. So I appreciate your time. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for listening.
Yes, thank
Have a
you.
good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.